Hey everyone, Sinix here. It's time for more anatomy quick tips. And I know this might sound like a poor topic, because it is, but in this episode we'll be covering all anatomy and talking about skin. For once, we don't need to worry about structure and form. We will instead be barely scratching the surface of things, and therefore we will only be doing painting today. So let's go ahead and start exfoliating. Alright, although a bit different, this video will still have sections, and this first section is all about value. Before we begin, let's just get a bit of value in the background, and I'll explain why later on. But anyway, one of the most difficult parts of learning to paint skin is getting a good feel for the contrast range. Every type of material reflects light differently, and skin is no different. So how reflective is skin? Well, it's definitely nowhere near most metals, but because it has oils and moisture in it, it can be a bit shiny. Regardless of how accurate you can be with how reflective it truly is, most beginners tend to go a bit strong with the contrast range. So I suggest taking it to a more low contrast zone. Usually this will wind up feeling more realistic. Plus, it's useful for just getting better at your subtle value control. Aside from the general feel of things, you can improve your skin rendering by learning which areas of skin tend to be more oily and reflective. The area around the eye is a great example of this, which makes it a good place for brighter tones. Aside from the reflectivity, one other thing that can affect the tonal value is the hue variety that results from parts of the skin being more exposed to the sun. Our melanin results in those darker, more reddish tones, so it's reasonable to hint at them even if you're just working in black and white. There are lots of reasons to find these value variations in the skin. Sometimes it's from the red tones associated with constantly being exposed to the sun. Sometimes it's the red tones from the thicker, capillary-rich areas of fleshy skin, such as on the cheeks. Has a little bit of both there, actually. Regardless of the reason, I'm going to show you some of the areas that you can always have a bit of fun with darker tones and colors. So, starting from the bottom, darkness on the feet and lower legs can be good for a more adventure-y, barefooted character, but it can also be useful to go extra light on a more heavily sheltered character. The knees and elbows tend to be a good spot for a little darkness regardless, and the hands are another optional one, but personally, I think it looks great to just heavily gradiate into the hands, obviously more so on the top of the hands and arms than on the palm side. But I think a heavy gradation can be pretty good for implying a strong sense of visual flow between the hands and arms. Hands can somewhat get a bit disjointed looking otherwise. Anyway, the shoulders and back of the neck can be a great place for adding tone for an outdoorsy character. And lastly, the face will definitely catch some deeper tones all across the middle from ear to ear. But you know, this would actually relate more to the color zones of the face, so let's just go ahead and fully move into color. So, like most artists, I learned the color zones of the face long ago. From that blue feeling on the bottom, from the stubble and closeness to the jawbone, to the red through the middle with its fleshy capillaries, to that more ochre hue through the top. Of course, you can even go more in depth and subdivide smaller zones, maybe some purplish blues around the eyes and whatnot. But this method definitely leaves some gaps. Notably, we're going to talk more about darker skin tones. I did a video on dark skin tones years ago, but I think I can condense that and somewhat improve upon it. To start out with, darker tones tend to have more red in them. I strongly suggest shifting your hue slightly toward red every time you pick a darker value. If you simply use the same orange tones that you probably use for lighter skin tones, they'll definitely start to feel more greenish as you get darker. It is good to note that because you might want to capture that tone as well at some point. Anyway, back to the more sciencey side of the topic, we know that a white surface reflects far more light than a black surface, which mostly absorbs it. One important thing to note about this is that by not reflecting as much, you can actually get a stronger sense for the hue variations in the subtle ambient light and bounce light that is all around. So when it comes to darker skin tones, not only are you seeing less of these subdermal hue variations, because the skin has more pigment, but you're also seeing far more of the reflected environment. One other aspect of darker surfaces reflecting less of the light spectrum is that the highlights tend to have a much tighter range for where you would actually show the highlight. In many ways, this clarity and bounce color and tightening of the highlights might seem similar to what happens in a highly reflective surface such as chrome, but weirdly enough, it's actually happening for the opposite reasons. The best way to think of it might be like controlling the exposure on a camera. By technically taking in less information, you're able to visually understand more information. Alright, this is getting heavily scientific, so let's just put this all into practice. I like to consider the most important step in painting skin to be getting some hue variation early on. Since we've gone through the science, we can safely focus on airbrushing in the classic undertone color zones for very pale skin, and airbrushing in the surrounding environmental light for darker skin. Everything in between is just a mixture of the two. A lot of artists have definitely overlooked just how fun it is to play around with these concepts and paint darker skin tones. And most of that is because they have tried to develop a one-size-fits-all approach. Anyway, after airbrushing in that hue variety, now I get to just play around and render out the forms of all the features. Of course, this is also where that second component of darker surfaces comes into play. Because of the threshold of the highlights being smaller, you can focus on trying to indicate form with the highlights on darker skin tones. Whereas on a lighter skin, it's all about showing form with the shadows. It's a subtle mental distinction, but it definitely helps. Anyway, those practice examples are still a bit rough and messy, so keeping the theory in mind, let's just approach things normally. With my gray background, I'm just going to paint a rough head shape as if I was doing a regular character painting. I'll be adding in some slightly more dark reddish lines and shapes to represent the main ambient occlusion spots. This step could be replaced by overlaying your line work on some orangish multiply layer, that is, if you had sketched the face first, which I did not. Anyway, I did these base colors on a separate layer, so I can just lock transparency and move to the hue variation step. Because this skin tone is on the lighter side, I'm going to airbrush in the classical color zones of the face that we already talked about. With that in there, I can just add some basic forms to the key plane changes on the face, always aiming for a hard edge on one side and a soft edge on the other. You can find my anatomy videos that cover the planes around the eyes, nose, mouth, neck, and ears, but other than those, the cheekbone will be the major spot to look out for. At this point, I recommend squinting your eyes and noticing how low the overall contrast level of this painting is. It should feel pretty unified. Now, my ambient occlusion spots definitely got washed out by all of that painting, but that's fine because it gives me a fun chance to add them back in again and see things pop. After touching up some of the forms and highlights, I think I'll just leave this face at this stage. It took roughly 15 minutes from start to finish, which is fine for this purpose. This is going to be a great opportunity for yet another skin tone experiment. So, if I were to copy and paste this face, I could certainly darken the tones and maybe have something passable for a darker skin tone. It's certainly not terrible or anything, but once again, I do feel like it's not as good as it could be. A lot of the older darker skin tones I painted used to look a lot like this, but let's do one more copy-paste and adapt some of the stuff we learned. I'm going to start by going a bit more reddish with the tones and then focus on bouncing the colors of the environmental lighting onto the skin in more defined and compacted ways. I'll be going with the classic outdoor blue sky ambience, and that's pretty much it. It's simple and quick, but comparing it to the one on the left, I do think it's a lot more fun and interesting. Alright, I think this video is going to have way too many faces, so let me at least get a full body in here. I've already blobbed one out over here based on a quick sketch I had done previously, and yep, I'm back to my fun muscle dude nonsense. The process will basically be the same. I'm doing a big airbrushing pass to create hue variety in all of the places I mentioned earlier in the video. You can see I can't get enough of the heavy gradation leading into the arms. But after that, I'm just doing my super Sinix triangle-based rendering method, which just involves using triangles for all of the ambient occlusion areas. And I'll definitely do a full video about that soon. After the triangular shapes, it's time for form shading. This time you can try doing it with the lasso tool like I am here. It makes it pretty simple. The last thing I'll do is add some rim lighting on my shadow side with, once again, as many triangles as possible. And there we go. It was super speedy, but should look like pretty believable skin. Once again, you can squint your eyes and take note of how small I made the value range. Anyway, this whole video is painting, so I don't know if there's a huge point in doing another big painting part, but why not? Let's just do it. I have some lovely skulls here from the previous episodes, so maybe I can try to unflay these and graft on some skin. The most important step to getting a healthy base color is to make sure you're using a nice mid-tone in the background. In fact, if you find your skin tones always come out too bright, try starting them on a darker background. If you find they're often too orange, then try bringing some colder tones into the background. You can help correct a lot of issues by choosing your background wisely. My standard cool mid-tone background is a result of knowing that most people err on the side of making skin tones too light and too warm. Moving on, yet again, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to start off with some good hue variations. You probably don't need me to mention all of the logic of it again though. Hopefully doing it a few times already has made it sink in, because I'm just going to be running with things for a bit and zoning out into the rendering. If you've watched the other videos in this series, I've definitely said about all I can say about this basic rendering approach. It's all about figuring out where to use hard edges and where to use soft edges. But how do you do that? Well, I'll actually give you all a huge, giant art tip right here. Think about your painting as a drawing once in a while. You can pretty much have soft blended edges everywhere, but every time you add a hard edge, you need to process the painting as if that were a line on your line drawing. Then you can decide, am I okay with having a line there? If you think that line would be fine in the drawing, then go ahead, make a hard edge. If you wouldn't use that line in your drawing, then don't paint a hard edge there. And think carefully about that, because if you're drawing or painting a younger looking face, you don't want to have that many lines. It's as simple as that for beginners. You can get more experimental with this concept later on. Of course, my other standard tip is to just make sure you really pick out those ambient occlusion crevices, and once you do pick out those dark crevices, make sure to saturate those values as much as you can. Alright, I'm really speeding through the rest of the rendering process, but while I do that, I have a random thought about skin tones. A big part of this video has been about adjusting how you approach skin tones depending on how dark or light the skin tone is. What is somewhat interesting is that a lot of the current trends in art have definitely been leaning toward the side of enhancing the feeling of ambient color on the skin tones. Just tons of ambient bounced light. And I can see that in most of the popular Instagram artists today, and I mentioned it in my video about post-realism. But I never mentioned how a lot of these traits can best be practiced and demonstrated in darker skin tones. So if you want to be amazing at skin tones, you're going to need to practice a strong variety of skin tones from the darkest to the lightest. Both let you practice different concepts more clearly, and eventually you'll be able to apply those concepts to the subtlety of the opposite skin tones and get beautiful results on all tones. Alright, most of the stuff we've done so far has all revolved around very generic soft lighting. But of course, we need to have some fun with harsher direct light sources. Once again, these can be a bit more tightened on a darker skin tone, but this does also lead us to another fun trick that really shows up in the lighter skin tones, and that is of course subsurface scattering. Subsurface scattering is just the way light can penetrate the skin surface and get bounced around off the flesh and blood underneath, giving it that warm, glowing effect. The strength of this is determined by how easily the light penetrates through the skin, which is why it's so visible on things like ears. One popular way to enhance the effect this has on skin is to add a harsh line of saturated orange along the border of the direct light. Hey look, we finally have some rendered skin here. Is it creepy knowing that there are skulls hiding under each of these? I can't help but just want to peek under there a bit. Oh yeah, that's actually weird, but kinda cool. Anyway, I know this video might already be pretty long, but I do want to close things out by talking about all the little weird extra things that could assist your skin rendering. You know, blemishes, freckles, tattoos, body hair, all that dermal chaos. So let's just speed round this using all the stuff we've already painted. First up, the Curse of the Irish, freckles. This should be easy enough for me, a highly freckled person. You're just making dots everywhere, trying to vary the size and tones a bit, but mainly just focusing them on the areas that get exposed to the sun the most. Any upward facing planes that get a lot of sun will have the most freckling, and do remember that pigment gets a little bit redder as it gets darker. Alright, let's mention hair quickly as the other most common thing that you might wind up adding to skin. I talked about it in the hair video, but once again, I recommend priming the area that you will be adding hair to by first adding a bit of desaturated tone. Then you can just build up upon that. You can even hint at some peach fuzz on the skin in the areas getting hit by rim light, but why am I doing eyebrows and nonsense when I could be messing around with my muscle dude? I think it's time for some manly chest hair. I'll prime the area with some desaturation and then just use a technique of making 3 curling lines in a bit of a patchwork formation. You can start this pattern with bigger, softer brush strokes and then just build things up. By the end, if you want to go wild, you can switch to darker and thinner lines. Also, you can add a little bit of that effect with the rim light to really sell things. That looks pretty fun. Alright, I think it's time we get tatted up. I mentioned earlier how desaturating a skin tone too much can start to look greenish or bluish by comparison. We're actually going to exaggerate that feeling by making sure that any tattoo effect we add leans a bit more toward looking greenish rather than just using black. It's kind of a faded tattoo look, but you can experiment with whatever you like best. Now, I'm not a tattoo artist, so I'm just kind of making up random squiggles and nonsense. Some face tats on the left guy, and some weird garter belt tattoo on our manly body. I'll probably get rid of that. I can't seem to plan out anything too aesthetic, so I'll just flounder around a bit. I tried a little skull thing, I don't know, and then some geometric shapes on the wrist. Anyway, let's go back to those other faces and try some scarring. Scars tend to just be more pinkish and have dimensionality, so creating a bit of darker pink shadows and highlights can work just fine. Some scars also tend to be a bit shinier, so you can play around with a little bit of specularity. Scars are actually quite fun to do and practice, so I recommend trying it out sometime. Other pimples and blemishes will tend to just be round and just have some basic form lighting while maybe having a little bit of redness airbrushed around them. Bruising can be pretty weird. Usually it will start with a more condensed, darker area of red and purple, and then with time it will start to spread out and fade out into more cool blue and green tones. Eventually you might even get a little bit of yellow in there as well. Let's see, what else can we try? Maybe some wetness? Whether it's from sweat or water, it's good to have some idea of how it looks on skin. A lot of the time you'll just be noticing it with the increased specularity. You can go super strong with it, and honestly this can be pretty tough without reference, but I'll try to make it look somewhat okay. So after going just wild with specular highlights, potentially you can try showing actual beads of water and maybe drops running down over the skin as if the face on the left here was in the rain. I was fumbling around with it for a bit, but I think I started to figure it out. The streaks of water and the droplets should start with a darker tone first to really define the area and give it a set form. Then you can add a bit of glow to the bottom of any of the beads and a bright highlight on the top side. I tried to demonstrate this clearly on the right face, but it looks comically incorrect at this larger scale. It should be a lot tinier, but I'll just demonstrate what I'm talking about on the background in the center here. There we go, there's a giant bead of water for you, but I think I'm almost done making a mess of things. One last note about skin tones. A lot of different ethnicities and skin tones have less transparency in the skin tone, even if the pigment isn't super dark. With tones like that, you should be thinking more about ambient bounce light. I think we can even apply this to fantasy skin tones, so we can make a bluish skin tone over here and imply that it is fairly thin and translucent by focusing more on the underlying skin hue variation. Conversely, we could try a reddish purplish skin that is more dense and just focus on the balanced highlights and ambient colors. Okay, I think that's about it for my skin painting tips, so let's just finally wrap this video up. I hope you enjoyed watching this, and I hope your day is filled with inspiration. I want to thank all of you for supporting this channel by simply watching and enjoying these videos, and a special extra thank you to the Patreons who go above and beyond to support this content, and also have to endure my nonsense on Discord. You guys are great. Okay, see ya everyone.